I was initially planning to do a video on alien abductions, but my, as I call it, random obsession with specific times in history tends to rear its head. I have recently, or for a while, been interested on pre-contact Americas like the Aztecs, Mayan, Inca, Olmec, and many others, but I thought what other time in human history we have almost little info on, and it's mostly ignored. Yes, return to monkey. The Stone Age has been portrayed as humanity's time where we're just hunted and gathered for thousands of years, and we're pretty dumb. That isn't entirely wrong, but this era is technically the longest compared to our history on this planet. Humans, or modern Homo Sapiens, have been on Earth roughly for 300,000 years, or more considering there's still debates and sites that point out that we've probably been here for a while. For our learning about human history, the Stone Age is kind of the beginning of humanity. Then we start farming, which leads to the Bronze Age, Iron Age, Renaissance, then to the Modern Age, which is the, as you may now know it as the man-made horrors age. We do tend to see the Stone Age as the less developed age of our time because of the lack of giant structures, written history, and they mostly use stone tools, hence the name. Speaking of stones, they tend to be the most reliable information on this age, as the stone tools humans use and left behind give us an idea of how humans lived in the past. So I decided to make an Iceberg video going through the many Stone Age topics. I decided to only include entries that relate to the Stone Age of humans, as this era in time spans from 4 million to 4000 BC. Which is a huge span of time to go through, and this age is still being understood. I also include the fun and wacky theories regarding this time period. So without further ado, let's rock and roll with the Stone Age Iceberg.
What have I got?
Homo sapiens is a scientific name for our species, which means thinking man. What a way to stroke our own ego, I guess. Homo sapiens are the last remaining of the Homo genus, and it's the most widespread, with complex and civilizations and advanced technological development. But during the Stone Age, we Homo sapiens were the new kid on the block, who were trying to follow the lead of previous hominids like Homo erectus and Neanderthals, who expanded outside Africa and roamed Europe, Asia, and developed sophisticated stone tools. Obviously, we developed better tools and weapons that we expanded outside Africa and cursed up anything in our path through Europe to the Americas. Not to mention the millions of years of human evolution that led to the modern human. There's also many things that Homo sapiens have done that are under the iceberg, so I'm gonna shorten this entry here.
What have I got?
In this entry, I want to talk about the misconceptions we have of archaic and primitive humans of the Stone Age, as the word caveman is used to describe an archetype of prehistoric humans. Probably what you think when you imagine a caveman as a hairy, aggressive, unintelligent, and grunting wild man with animal skin that's clothed with a club living in a cave lit by a fire. In some popular media like the Flintstones, they are depicted living with dinosaurs and use nothing but stone technology. Besides the stone technology, the description of cavemen by popular media is very not so accurate. To start, you probably see cavemen depicted side by side with dinosaurs, which would be pretty cool, but realistically the dinosaurs will be dominating us. Because without the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, we wouldn't even stand a chance against them. So y'all be thankful to the asteroid that landed in the Gulf of Mexico for that. The aggressive and unintelligent aspect of cavemen is kind of inaccurate. The aggressive part is understandable because we were still at the will of nature, and being aggressive hunters in a hostile environment probably was beneficial. The unintelligent part doesn't make sense as primitive humans survive and thrive in harsh conditions that require sophisticated thinking and planning. A prime example of that is how we managed to quickly expand and prosper in different lands across the world. Hell, even Homo erectus and other early hominids managed to spread all over the continent with just some sticks and stones and some elbow grease, as God intended. As you'll see throughout this iceberg, cavemen left us many works of their art and artifacts. Sure, cavemen probably didn't have hygiene or ethics, but goddammit, they did seem to manage to take the meaning of our nature with just simple stone tools, something no other animal has stepped up to the challenge, and in my book that's pretty big brain of them. Also, the name caveman is also inaccurate as our Paleolithic ancestors didn't exclusively live in caves. More than likely we had like mobile homes that were made of bones and animal skin. So the more you know.
What have I got?
Bipedalism is basically something that walks on two legs. Which, wow, isn't that something humans do? Bipedalism is one of the skills we have that defines us to the point that one of the oldest known human ancestors, Australopithecus, specialized in walking upright almost 4 million years ago. So walking upright is one of the most defining features of humans, and helps identify other hominid species in the fossil record. So why walk on two legs instead of four, cause clearly four is more than two? The most common theory for explaining this is the savanna-based theory. This theory posits that early hominids were forced to walk on two legs because of the changes of the environment or transitioning to a new environment. Bipedalism would give some advantages to early hominids by letting them see over tall grass to avoid predators and freeing up their hands for other uses. Of course, this theory is under scrutiny as there have been evidence of older hominid species that walked on 2 legs, but we're still living a tree climbing life. Bipedalism is what probably kickstarted the long road to the Homo genus, as it is one of the most oldest traits that define us, and splits us up from the other great apes.
What have I got?
This phrase is sometimes used to define where we came from in the context of human evolution. It is sort of a short answer to where we came from as a species, but just like current events, it's very complicated. Labeling humans as a result of monkeys is not false, as we share our lineage with the great apes or hominidae like gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. But we did branch out of that family to become hominins. At the same time, how do we define the species that are transitioning or becoming a new species? Technically, we're the descendants of great apes, but we're clearly different from the rest. It is strange to think that we are descended from apes, as we perceive ourselves to be more than just animals. Yet, once we compare the skeletons of all the great apes, including us, there's some similarities. Speaking of comparisons, the March of Progress, you know, this iconic image, has in a way taught us about human evolution, but it's kind of misleading. If you were someone who was not familiar with the topic of evolution, you'll probably think that evolution is a linear path to something more advanced. And yes, this is somewhat correct, as evolution is the invisible force that dictates what gets to survive or go extinct. However, if you were to look up hominid or hell even other animal lineages, you'll see a tournament-like family tree of the species because, as you may have guessed, evolution likes to experiment and likes to see what sticks. I just think the image of the March of Progress having a monkey-like animal at the beginning might put the idea of us descending from monkeys into the mainstream, but who really knows?
What have I got?
The Ice Age are these periods of long periods of time where the weather is cold enough to get extended ice sheets on Earth. During the Stone Age, the Ice Age was in full swing, covering half of America and Europe. With the Ice Age holding the world hostage, humans and other hominids were roaming the continents exploring unknown lands. It wasn't until around maybe 20,000 years ago that we started seeing the ice retreat back, opening up new lands. It is believed because of the retreat of the ice, it ended up opening up the Americas to Homo Sapiens to cross over. The Ice Age and the end of the Ice Age was the period of time where Homo Sapiens and other hominids like Homo erectus and Neanderthals started to thrive. Just because it was cold outside, it didn't prevent early hominids from traveling outside their lands. Around this time, we see Neanderthals dominating Europe and Asia, and depending on the year, Homo Sapiens were either leaving Africa or sticking around Africa to avoid the cold. In conclusion, the Ice Age didn't prevent hominids from expanding, but at the end of the Ice Age, it did mark a new era that Homo Sapiens were now becoming the dominant force.
What have I got?
Human Bestiliality refers to the abilities we lost because of evolution. Examples would be the appendix, wisdom teeth, tailbone, body hair, ear muscle, and more. These traits have been lost because we stopped using them. The appendix is believed to be a leftover of when we used to eat fibrous vegetation or just grass. Same with the appendix, wisdom teeth are also a reminder that we used to eat a plant-based diet. These vestigial organs give us a great amount of information about our past, as we can draw from these organs how we used to live. We can tell what early humans ate and how they adapted to their environment. It is also a great example of evolution that you can witness, and it shows how connected to nature we still are. Humans have come a long way from the early hominids that were walking upright in the savannas of Africa, and we have the vestigial organs to prove it.
What have I got?
Stone tools are the reason we call it the Stone Age, because humans really had a knack at banging rocks together. The oldest known tools we found was at the site in Kenya named the Lowenki 3 site, where a possible ancestor to the Homo genus named Australopithecus afarensis had these sophisticated tools that at this time there's still debate on its authenticity. They had these 30-pound stone anvils where they would use them to shape stone. There's also evidence of knapping, which to those who don't know, knapping is just banging rocks together but on rank. Knapping allows stones to be chipped and shaped into a more desirable shape, like a point to use to hunt. These artifacts are dated to be from 3 million years ago, meaning that something that maybe was going to become a hominid was already playing on competitive mode that far back. Good on Australopithecus afarensis for dunking on Homo habilis on the oldest recorded stone tools. Furthermore, stone tools would be the staple of the Paleolithic human arsenal, from simple rocks to specialized stone tips, spears, and arrows. Humanity and its ancestors had the determination to innovate probably the one and only technology they had at the time.
What have I got?
Besides banging rocks together, the other important technology hominids acquired was fire. Fire only acquired three things: oxygen, heat, and fuel, which can be found in nature but require some elbow grease. The most definitive proof of taming of fire is the artifacts at Qesem Cave in Israel. In the cave there was the standard hammer stones and hand axes. There was also burned bones that showed they were butchered and then cooked. In addition, there was this 300,000-year-old heart that showed signs of being used to cook food. The use and taming of fire is one of the greatest leaps in humanity's history. The use of fire was beneficial as it gave Homo sapiens warmth, light, cooked food, protection, helped in toolmaking, and importantly it made us socialize. The taming of fire is so significant that almost every culture has a mythology around it, like the story of Prometheus giving humanity the ability to use fire, and he got severely punished for that. There's also the cooking hypothesis, and where the ability to grill allowed for the development of the brain, because of how nutritional cooked food is than raw food, but who truly knows?
What have I got?
If hominids had an Indeed account, their longest held job would have been Hunter-Gatherer. Hunter-gathering essentially means hunting wild game for food and foraging for wild plants. It also includes being nomadic, which meant that they didn't stick around in one place, mainly because they were following their seasonal migration of the foods like deer or buffalo. It is believed that for almost 90% of the Homo genus' history was being a hunter-gatherer, meaning for the longest of time, humans been on that grind, and it shows, considering that when humans inhabit a new area, animals tend to go bye-bye. Just like the Paleo Diet, humans have relied on nature for their substance like hunting wild game, foraging plants, and should also include fishing and scavenging. Being a hunter-gatherer goes perfect for our species, as we have the ability to hunt prey for long distances, employ stone tools to help us take down bigger prey, using fire to barbecue the prey for a more nutritional diet, and also socialize around the fire to tell stories or teach the next generation how to hunt. Gathering also plays a big part as hunting, as our ability to firmly grasp objects made it easier to carry back wild berries, plants, and other important food sources. The knowledge that had to be passed down in order for humans to survive must have been important, considering how widespread and adapted we are in the Stone Age. This also means humans or other hominids didn't have leisure time, as you can probably tell from the many artifacts and art they left us. It wasn't until humans started cultivating crops around 11,000 years ago that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle became less and less practiced.
What have I got?
These hypotheses were a debated topic on the migration of early hominids and subsequently modern humans. So let's start with the one that came first, the multi-regional hypothesis. The multi-regional hypothesis explains that Homo sapiens came around simultaneously around the globe. It explains that the ancestors of Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia around 2 million years ago. Over the span of millions of years, Homo sapiens managed to appear from interbreeding with other species and at the time evolved parallel from each other across the continents. You might think, well, what's the evidence? Well, most of the evidence is just some morphology and gene similarities with the archaic hominids and modern regional inhabitants, which doesn't really give us a definitive proof of where Homo sapiens came from. It wasn't until recent years that a newer and more accepted model was introduced. The out of Africa model explains that Homo sapiens migrated more than once out of Africa. The first one being Homo erectus, who were most likely the first ever hominids to venture out of Africa. The second migration was a new up and coming species called Homo sapiens, who will spread out and replace the other hominid species around the globe. The out of Africa model has strong DNA and sites that point the finger towards Africa being the point of origin of modern Homo sapiens. But as time passes, new discoveries and debates have come up with some evidence showing a more earlier and complex answer to the origins of humans. Nonetheless, the out of Africa model is the most widely accepted theory of how humans migrated and spread out around the world. But who knows, maybe the discovery of more sites and DNA evidence could finally give us a clearer answer to our roots.
What have I got?
In the context of this video, when I refer to the missing link, I mean the link between species that have not yet been discovered, and also the missing link of humans and great apes. The missing link refers to the empty spots on the family tree of a species that shows a change or divide of the species. For example, the missing links of the Homo family tree shows that we still don't know what our ancestors were, but we can see where certain species branch off from one another and can conclude that certain species have a common ancestor. The discovery of more hominid species does help fill out the blanks of the lineage. However, it becomes a difficult question what to consider as the same species or a new species. How do you tell the difference between two species that look the same or share similar traits? The word missing link has also been used to describe recent hominid discoveries that claim to be the final piece of the puzzle. Yet there's been multiple claims of missing links throughout history that are still debated. That's why recently the word missing link has been replaced by last common ancestor, which specifies the genes of the species to place them in a more accurate descendant list. Overall, missing links are the more speculative and mysterious parts of evolution that still have us scratching our heads.
What have I got?
The East African Rift, or as is known as the Cradle of Humanity, is the location of many well-preserved human fossils and most likely influenced the development of human evolution. The rift is responsible for forming lakes and impacting the regional climate. Probably because of the rift's role in drastically changing the climate from wet to dry periods of time, the sudden changes in climate will push hominids into adapting bipedalism or push them into migrating to other lands. Just as it impacted human evolution, it also harbors the most and well-preserved fossils of the Homo genus and others. For example, Lucy, who is the name of a fossilized bone of a female Australopithecus afarensis that was discovered in Ethiopia, gives us a good amount of information on how very early human-like traits started to appear in the fossil record like bipedalism and brain size. Not to mention that Lucy is understood to be alive around 300 million years ago, which makes it one of the oldest evidence of our very distant ancestors. Another example is the Turkana boy that was discovered in Kenya. The Turkana boy is an early form of Homo erectus that dates to be from 1.5 million years ago. The boy was most likely 7 to 11 years old when he died and was maybe able to communicate vocally. The boy also showed signs of walking upright and had tuning style toned tools with him, which gives us more of an idea of how he lived. The East African Rift has volcanic and sedimentary activity that makes it ideal for preserving bones, as the two examples I gave are the few early hominid remains that have almost half a skeleton preserved, compared to the archaic human remains who only have a few finger bones and molars left to go off of. Thankfully, the East African Rift has given us a good amount of specimens that we can study, and I'm optimistic that we may find new species or find an answer to our old questions.
What have I got?
Trepanning is probably the world's oldest surgery that humans have done. It's basically drilling holes on your skull for medical reasons. About more than 1500 skulls from the Neolithic period have been found with these holes. We kind of don't know why they did this. Maybe it was some sort of treatment for head trauma or more of a spiritual healing. It's anyone's guess, but it's not like they didn't know what they were doing. As of 40% of the skulls show signs of healing over, meaning the person getting a hole punched to their skull was still going back to work afterwards. I don't know personally how they did it. That Paleolithic shaman must have had hands of a surgeon because they were only using sharp rocks to probably get these circular holes. Furthermore, trepanning shows that humans, given the time and passion, will find weird ways to treat and help each other, even if it's not that effective.
What have I got?
The older one is considered the first ever stone industry dating to 2.5 million years ago. The older one's stone tool is pretty simple to make, it's just flaked off a part of a rock to get these sharp edges. Just like most stone tools during this time, it was most likely a multi-purpose tool, basically the archaic hominid version of a Swiss army knife. For how old these stone tools are, it begs the question, who made them? That question is still under scrutiny, as the most possible candidates for these tools are Homo habilis, Homo erectus, or a late Australopithecus species. Most of the more older sites of these stone tools are located in, as you might have guessed if you paid attention, in the East African Rift, specifically Tanzania, as these early stone tools give us a starting point to where more complex stone making could have came from, and how the mastering of smacking rocks together propelled us to where we are now, for better or for worse.
What have I got?
The migration of early hominids out of Africa is still being understood, but we have a good idea how it went down. Starting most likely when Homo erectus came into the picture and started to migrate out of Africa around 2 million years ago. The evidence for this is the old one industry that I talked earlier, and the sites in China and Indonesia where remains have been found date back to 1.7 million years ago. Most likely Homo erectus took the route of going to the Middle East and expanding on both directions to Asia and Europe. The reasoning for the migration could have been that there were more options for food outside of Africa, and that Homo erectus were fit to survive the harsh conditions. Probably around this time, another Homo species decided to explore out, which was Homo heidelbergensis, who most likely is our link between Neanderthals and us. When it came to us, we were just following what our past relatives have done, but obviously Homo Sapiens managed to not only have a European nation in the span of 1,000 years, but get to the Americas through passing a glacial hellscape. From what we know, Homo Sapiens are the only hominid species to inhabit the Americas. So we managed to not only do what Homo erectus have done, but go above and beyond to thrive in a completely different environment than we haven't seen before. The swift expansion of our species in the past is still being understood. As more sites and remains are found, it keeps pushing the date back, hinting at a more quicker migration into the world. But why? It could have been like our previous species where expanding out was more beneficial and gave more opportunity. It could have been the changes of climate because of the ice melting during the end of the Ice Age, causing massive environmental shifts that leave our species in a vulnerable spot, or it could have been both or other reasons. Nonetheless, the migration of hominids really shows that the spread of our species is something that we were, in a way, made to do.
What have I got?
Neanderthals were our cousins on the family tree of hominids. They migrated earlier than Homo sapiens and spread out into mainly Europe and some parts of Asia. Their reign probably lasted from 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, where they made some real progress up until we came around. Well, first let's talk about how they looked. Neanderthals were a more shorter and stockier and stronger hominid species compared to humans. But they did have similarities with Homo sapiens to the point that maybe the two species came from a common ancestor, which is thought to be Homo heidelbergensis. Neanderthals also have a more bigger brain than Homo sapiens, which up until recently, Neanderthals were thought to be more aligned to the caveman archetype. But this evidence of a bigger brain size gives an idea of how intelligent and developed they were. Neanderthals left us many artifacts, bones, and tools. Speaking of bones, many of the Neanderthal bones show signs of heavy trauma like broken ribs or healing over a broken bone. The trauma gives us a hint that Neanderthals, unlike Homo sapiens, were more up and close and personal when hunting, as most of the injuries were caused by animal attacks. Besides the brute force Neanderthals had, they also had close-knit family groups, stone tools, art, and clothes that gave them an advantage on the harsh, cold European climate at the time. But their reign will come to an end, as more than likely the introduction of Homo sapiens migrating into Europe and Asia that might spell the end for them. No one truly knows what happened to Neanderthals, but we can make some guesses. Some point to the change of the climate as their fall. As I mentioned earlier, the arrival of Homo sapiens more than likely was the main reason. Either we fought for resources or they were bred out of extinction is not known, as more than likely the advancements of Homo sapiens overshadowed and overcompeted with Neanderthals that couldn't adjust to the changes that were occurring in their environment. Personally, I think it's strange to think that there was another human species walking around the same time we were around, probably confusing each other, not being able to communicate, but realizing that maybe they're not so different. I don't know, it's kind of melancholic that we're the last remaining of the Homo species, the species who spread out over the continent where different species sharing those same continents. My bad, I was just rambling. On to the next entry.
What have I got?
The Paleo Diet is the idea that eating what our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate has beneficial effects. The Paleolithic diet surprisingly had been a fad going back to the 1800s, and it wasn't until the 2000s where it became a $400 million industry. The diet proposes to cut out processed foods, dairy, wheat, sugar, oils, and alcohol. So what do you eat? I wondered that myself. Well, if you like vegetables, fruits, nuts, meats, roots, eggs, and probably more depending on who you ask. This is what the Paleo Diet promotes to eat for a healthy body. The diet also promotes the benefits like reversing diabetes, reducing heart disease, weight loss, and a plethora of more claims. I will agree that cutting off processed, high calorie, high sugar, and high salt foods can lead to a more healthier diet and health. God forbid that ancient hominids had access to McDonald's, because they would have started and erect a crude stone statue of their clown god and sacrificed their firstborn to Grimace. It is hard to definitely know what exactly our Paleolithic ancestors ate, but we have an idea. Besides meat and seafood, plants would have been a big part of the Paleo diet, and also other people, but we're not going to talk about that. You may be asking where's the roots, vegetables, and fruits. Well, if you truly consider what our Paleolithic ancestors ate, they wouldn't have access to the benefits of agriculture. So no fruits or vegetables because during the Paleolithic era, humans haven't domesticated them yet. They did have access to wild berries or fruits and vegetables we now know. On the other side, some paleo diets promote the overconsumption of meat, even though yes, our ancestors did eat meat, and wasn't as abundant as we have them today, and if you were to look at our teeth, we have more molars than canine teeth that hints that we had more of a plant diet. I'm not hating on the paleo diet, I'm just bringing up that the paleo diet is not really an accurate representation of what our ancestors ate. Probably changing the name to the Neolithic or even the Bronze Age diet will probably be more accurate.
What have I got?
The domestication of dogs is one of the oldest and first attempts of domestication by humans, as the domestication of animals mostly starts around the time when humans started farming, so the fact that dogs even predate that shows that we have a long and mysterious history with our canine friends. It is believed that dogs may have split off from an extinct species of wolf, and that they most likely interbred with other wolf species. The main hypothesis or theory of how dogs came to be is that a species of wolf decided to hang around the hunter-gatherer humans for whatever reason. It could have been for food, survival, or even company. The domestication of dogs by humans is probably the match made in heaven, because we are both very social animals and we both use pack hunting to our advantage. So a wild, docile wolf could have easily established a relationship with a human in the past, and it probably would have benefited them both. Not only did we domesticate dogs, but they did it back to us, as dogs made us more social, caring, and dependent on them during the Stone Age, and even to this day, as it helped us hunt down big game, play as guards, and give us warnings of danger. The current understanding is that the domestication of dogs probably happened more than once and in different locations. Humans more than likely use selective breeding to domesticate dogs by breeding out bad traits and keeping desirable traits like being friendly to humans. The oldest known evidence of domestication is the location of Iceberg Castle Bonn, Germany, where a burial site shows two humans buried alongside a dog dating back to 40,000 years ago. What's interesting about the burial of the dog is that it shows signs of being sick when it was alive, which meant that the owner of the dog had to be taking care of it over time. And also the fact that it was buried with two other humans shows that the canine was just as significant as the people it was buried with. Hopefully more research is done on this subject, as I feel it's important to know more about our canine comrades and to answer the question of how dogs came to be.
What have I got?
Homo erectus, or translate to mean upright human, is one example of a Homo species besides us that managed to venture out of Africa and thrive on Asia. Homo erectus mostly stood around 5 feet to 6 feet tall, probably weighing around 80 to 150 pounds. Having a very pronounced brow ridge with a flat face, they surprisingly were so human looking compared to other species of that time. And they also had proportionally bigger brain sizes, obviously not as big as ours, but by the looks of their sights, it seems that they were pretty successful with what they had. As Homo erectus ruled over for almost 2 million years compared to us, which is roughly 300,000 years. Homo erectus more than likely had a lifestyle similar to hunter-gatherers, as it showed they primarily hunted big game like elephants, rhinos, bovines, and many more. Homo erectus is believed to be responsible for the Acheulean industry, which are these production of stone hand axes and other tools that are made by banging rocks together or napping, as I mentioned earlier. These sophisticated tools would help in erectus' success into traversing to Asia and some parts of Europe. On top of having stone tools, they also seem to be the earliest hominids to tame fire, which will explain how they survived the cold climates of Europe of that time. The placement of Homo erectus on the Homo family tree is still debated. As early of the discovery of Homo erectus fossils, Homo erectus were thought to be the missing link between humans and apes, but nowadays we see them as Homo Sapiens' uncle, who maybe be our direct ancestor, but is still questionable. Regardless, the many fossils and sites like the Takanda Boy, Peking Man, Java Man, and many more gives us a great insight on this archaic human. They even have subspecies and geographical differences that further complicate our lineage and bring into question what is considered part of Homo erectus or another species. Hopefully we get to know more of this species, as it's quite impressive and strange to think that another way older species of human ruled the continent similarly like we did. It makes you wonder.
What have I got?
The migration and settling of the Americas is thanks to the Paleo Indians. The Paleo Indians are the first group of Homo sapiens who probably came from Asia to pass through the Bering Strait to get to the Americas. The prevailing theory is that they were following the megafauna they hunted to enter the new land. The reason why we think this is that most of the evidence of their culture and inhabitants is their Clovis points. The earliest Clovis point we have dates back to 11,000 years ago, where they were used to hunt and kill large prey. Another piece of evidence that gives us an idea and dates to their arrival is kill sites. Kill sites are where large animals like mammoths or giant ground sloths are killed and butchered for consumption. After all, this is what remains of the bones of the animal. That gives us a hint on how they live by seeing how they butcher the animal, and if we're lucky, we'll even have the Clovis point that cut off the meat nearby. It still is quite fascinating how fast they managed to almost race from Alaska to Peru in a matter of a few thousand years. Like I mentioned before, the definitive timeline of their migration to the Americas is still up to debate, and the discovery of more sites help us fill the empty spaces of history. The Paleo Indians give us the ancestry of later and modern Native American groups, and gives us an idea of how the Americans looked during the Paleolithic era, where humans had to not only learn this new land, but hunt down monsters that could easily take them out.
What have I got?
Before any rhyme system or Twitter, we have petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are images that are either carved or engraved on a piece of rock. As you can tell from the images, they're pretty simple, with stick figures probably representing humans, various animals, and a lot of symbols, and also monsters. Probably something you will draw in the corner of a notebook in history class when you're bored. Petroglyphs can be found almost anywhere in the world besides Antarctica. Depending on the location and subject of the petroglyphs, from what we can guess, they represent a landmark like a modern version of a stop sign, where it'll tell travelers or hunters where to hunt or give warnings. Some petroglyphs are assumed to be made for religious, cultural, and ritualistic reasons. Others are presumed to be markers to give directions or to represent a sort of territorial line. Whatever they were used for, petroglyphs were an important part of humans' everyday life. It probably was an early version or a stepping stone to early writing systems. As most things on the list, petroglyphs represent a missing piece of the puzzle, as we don't definitely know why they were carved for. Maybe they were used for different occasions, or maybe they were in a way for humans to express themselves, to communicate or articulate some sort of message that we sadly have forgotten about.
What have I got?
Probably the most unknown and recent Homo species that came onto the stage, Denisovans are one of the recent Homo species that have been identified only through DNA evidence in the year 2010. Compared to other Homo species, Denisovans have almost the least amount of evidence of their existence. But thanks to the advancement of genetics, we managed to find them in a cave called the Denisova Cave. In this and other caves, we have discovered molars, a finger bone, and bone fragments that barely give us any evidence of who they were. A lot of knowledge we have about Denisovans stems from their DNA that seemed to imply a more diverse world that was inhabited by multiple Homo species at the same time, meaning that Homo Sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans were living amongst each other and most likely screwed each other, as some of the Denisovans' DNA has a mix of Neanderthal and Homo Sapien in there, and vice versa for Homo Sapiens, as it's shown that people from Tibet, Melanesians, and Australian Aboriginals carry around 3 to 5 Denisovan DNA. Speaking of Tibetans, Sherpas probably inherited a gene from the Denisovans that allowed them to easily live in high altitudes like the Himalayas. Slightly expanding from 300,000 to 50,000 years ago, Denisovans likely had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle similar to other Homo species, and maybe had access to sophisticated stone tools, but this is still under scrutiny, as the caves they were found in also have remains of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in them too. They're likely cousins to Neanderthals as they share similar genes. Hopefully more Denisovan fossils, bones, and maybe stone artifacts are found, or identified to be from the Denisovans so that it can give us a lick of an idea of how they lived.
What have I got?
The social brain hypothesis states that our development of our brain getting bigger gave us more brain power to deal with more complex concepts like language and social relationship. This type of thinking is not new, as our development of the brain through thousands or millions of years has given us the upper advantage in nature, and we can see through our lineage that our brain capacity is getting bigger. In primates, the correlation of bigger brain size and bigger complex groups is there, as there's more data to store in the brain, and the ability to process this info has blessed our species, but it did come at a cost, and bigger wasn't always better. Firstly, maintaining a bigger brain required extra calories, so we had to look out for more nutritious and tastier foods that can easily satisfy our brains. The brain becoming bigger led to childbirth to become more difficult and dangerous for the females, as the infant's bigger dome had to go against millions of years of pelvic evolution. Speaking of bigger brains, if you remember the segment of Neanderthals, you'll remember that Neanderthals had a bigger brain capacity than us, so why did they lose, go extinct? That's why this is kind of a hypothesis, as it still isn't a definitive answer to every question. But this hypothesis gives us an answer on how we managed through socializing to become more efficient hunters, create tools, and dunk on our cousins with our achievements.
What have I got?
Unlike the less known petroglyphs, cave paintings get a lot of spotlight, and for good reason, as they're probably the oldest representation of artistic expression dating back to 64,000 years ago, and they look nice. Probably the one you know and seen are the ones in Europe, like the Shobek cave that has the panel of horses where you can see a variety of animals being depicted and overlapping with each other. The Altamira cave has this iconic bison painting that probably everyone has seen, and is pretty detailed, and it's in every history book. The Cave of Hands is another iconic set of paintings. As the name implies, it's a cave wall covered with nothing but hand outlines and handprints that is located in Argentina. Another iconic cave paintings are the Gran rock paintings. They have these human silhouettes that clearly have a certain art style to them. They are located in the land down under. Regardless of where you go, you will find cave paintings, but what do they mean and who made them? A majority of cave paintings are painted by us Homo sapiens, but there are some that are made from Neanderthals and Denisovans. Using pigments like ochre, hematite, and charcoal, it allowed them to get creative with it. Why they made it is something that we can only guess, like petroglyphs. Since a majority of cave art depicts animals, and humans were living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle at the time, some think that the paintings portray a hunting strategies, or teach about hunting, by descriptively describing the animals to hunt or avoid. Whatever reason they were made for, cave paintings are an integral part of this history, as it gives us a first-person view of what our ancestors seen and how they interpreted them. And unintentionally, they somewhat left us a part of their history, as some of the animals depicted are extinct, and in a way recorded their way of life. It's interesting to see that before the development of agriculture, humans had a way to express themselves without a writing system.
What have I got?
Once DNA sequencing was implemented to identify species, we found out that our species was getting their freak on. Throughout the Homo genus, we tend to categorize or split species from one another, as it makes it easier for us to understand them. But in reality, we found out that we weren't just purely Homo Sapiens, but a mixture of multiple species. Hell, we're probably a result of different hominid species mixing the gene pool. What I mean is that we didn't evolve independently or isolate from other hominids, but we got to know other species real personally. As it relates to us, some people out here are carrying 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in them, while others might have some Denos in them, or sometimes both. God, I wonder how that person looks like that carries more than one archaic human DNA in them. Even when we were still in Africa 300,000 years ago, just figuring out how to bang rocks together to make them sharper, we were still making booty calls to other species like Homo habilis and Homo heidelbergensis. So the idea that we just individually evolved from the others is not fully true as our DNA says otherwise, and it shows that we were a diverse and complex species. I just wonder what convinced our Paleolithic ancestors to hit up some Neanderthal across the land.
What have I got?
If you keep up with anything archaeology, you will probably heard of the site in recent times. Göbekli Tepe is a site located in the southern eastern Anatolia region of Turkey, where you can see these 5-foot tall stone pillars that have these animal iconography. What makes the Siberian point is that it was dated to be inhabited around 9500 BCE, which predates Stonehenge, and from what we know, they didn't seem to have any agriculture to support them. Basically, it's understood that for humans to stick to one location and build stone structures, it required them to have a surplus of food, so that they can feed the workforce to build them. So the fact that the site seemed to be built by hunter-gatherers is fascinating. As to why they built them is another question. Some hypothesize that the site was of religious importance, or was a sanctuary. Regardless of why it was built, this site has many amazing artifacts that depict animals and scenes that we hope one day to understand them. We learned that the inhabitants most likely ate cereal, not that type of cereal, had cisterns that collected rainwater, and had a lot of animal bone fragments. It wasn't until recent times that Göbekli Tepe was excavated by archaeologists and recognized for its importance. This is also an example of how discoveries like this can change our view of that time period, and how it can possibly be the earliest example of the start of a change in lifestyles from hunter-gatherers to a sedentary lifestyle. Hopefully over time we can learn more about who built them and what this site means in the grand scheme of our history.
What have I got?
Just like Denos, Homo floresiensis is another recent discovery in the Homo family tree that has changed how we view our species. In the Ling Ba cave in Indonesia around 2003, the discovery of Homo floresiensis shocked the world as their main feature was being no taller than 4 feet tall. Being nicknamed hobbits, this species was so short that it was mistaken for being the remains of a Homo sapien child. And it wasn't until they realized that the remains had fully developed teeth and pronounced brow ridge that they realized that this wasn't the Homo sapien. Homo floresiensis most likely ranged from 190,000 to 50,000 years ago, so a chance of them encountering us was likely, but there's no direct evidence that we did. What makes Homo floresiensis an anomaly is that they seem very different and primitive compared to us. They had smaller brain size, but that didn't stop them from developing stone tools to hunt down dwarf elephants and possibly Komodo dragons. Another thing to consider for this primitive species is how the hell did they get to the islands of Indonesia. There's a lot of questions regarding this species, to who were their ancestors, why did they get so small, are they directly related to us, are they any good at limbo? Just like most things on the list, I'm optimistic that more discoveries are made for this species, as they're so significantly different than us that it makes me more curious on how different and similar they were to us on a human level. Just keep your chin up, Short King.
What have I got?
The peopling of the Americas is a subject that's still being understood, but as always, we have some guesses. Where we can guess, there were more than one migration event. The first one being the mammoth hunting people that most likely came from a group in Siberia that decided to cross the Bering Land Bridge for greener lands, and they were right. But by the looks of things, it seemed they used the bridge to go back and forth from the Americas back to Siberia. It wasn't long for these people to get all the way down to South America. This is based on the sites that date the arrival of like the Clovis Culture in New Mexico, that date people being in the Americas around 13,000 years ago. Or the site in Brazil that's still under debate that dates human arrival to 25,000 years ago from a hole that was made in a giant ground sloth bone. As more sites are discovered, we tend to see the date for human arrival to the Americas go farther back. The reason that these days complicate the arrival of humans to the Americas is that the land bridge wasn't always accessible. What I mean is that the Bering land bridge was covered in alpine glaciers and ice sheets that prevented migration to the Americas around 30,000 years ago. It wasn't until around 50,000 years ago that the bridge was crossable for migration, so if the sites are right, how did humans get past this obstacle? The most accepted theory is that the humans waited until the bridge was cleared to get to the Americas. Another theory is that they found some pathway that led them to get early access to the Americas. A more recent theory proposes that we sailed the coast of the land bridge to get to the Americas. Whatever method humans used to get to the Americas, this migration shows how adaptive and persistent we were to bash some mammoths' heads in.
What have I got?
Lucy is a reference to a partially complete skeleton of an Australopithecus afarensis who is nicknamed Lucy. Lucy most likely lived as far back as 3.2 million years ago. She was 3.5 feet tall, weighing around 60 to 65 pounds, had a broad pelvis with angled femurs, which meant she walked on two legs, ate mostly a vegan diet, and has human and ape-like characteristics. Because we found 40% of her complete skeleton, that's how we know certain details about her. Since she belongs to the Australopithecus species, she most likely looked more ape-like and used simple stone tools, which basically was just a rock they found. The Australopithecus species is also probably the closest we ever get to a missing link, as she shows characteristics of what will later become the Homo species. Discovered in the Awash Valley site in Ethiopia, she is a great example of how we may have looked like, or how our distant ancestors may have looked like and lived. Walking on two legs, small brain, covered in hair, and climbing trees. Lucy didn't know it, but she may have been the start of something much bigger than herself. It's wild to imagine how our very distant ancestors lived. Were they more ape than human, or vice versa? Was Lucy's species the starting point to humanity? Who knows?
What have I got?
Named after the site it was discovered, which is Clovis, New Mexico, the Clovis culture or the widespread use of a certain stone tool known as Clovis around 13,000 years ago in the Americas. Clovis are these oval-shaped blades that are attached to spears or other weapons to deal damage. Mainly used by Paleo Indians, the Clovis was a very popular style of stone tool that was used in North America and some parts of South America. Probably related to the first inhabitants of the Americas, the Clovis culture left us many sites that show what the Clovis was used for. You guessed it, killing and butchering some of the most dangerous megafauna like woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, dire wolves, and many more. So you can imagine that if a certain style of stone weapons was effective, you'll see everybody in the area adopting it. And that's what you see in these many kill sites in the Americas, where skeletal remains of woolly mammoths have Clovis points nearby them, and sometimes see the damage the Clovis has done. Most likely the Clovis was used as a multi-purpose tool that was an integral part of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. At around 12,900 years ago, the Clovis culture started to disappear. Well, not really. More than likely the people that were using the Clovis found better material and will later develop their own regional cultures. On top of that, the decline and extinction of megafauna like the woolly mammoths contributed to the change of lifestyles. The Clovis culture marks a point in time where the wide openness of the Americas was not empty, but inhabited by hunters who worked together to take down beasts, and more than likely had traditions and rituals that was unique to them.
What have I got?
The Toba Catastrophe theory proposes that the eruption of the supervolcano in Lake Toba, Indonesia, was the leading cause of the human population bottleneck. A bottleneck refers to the sudden decline of a population and caused by environmental events like, a supervolcano or an asteroid. The Toba eruption occurred around 74,000 years ago and caused a volcanic winter where ash covered the sky and may have lowered the world temperature by 3 to 5 Celsius for several years. This dramatic change in climate could have wiped out species that couldn't compete with the change. The theory elaborates that the genetic bottleneck that occurred in humans around 60,000 years ago was a result of the Toba eruption that knocked down humanity to a population of 3 to 10,000 individuals, meaning in a way that we were in a time considered an endangered species. But this theory has some criticism. Some point to the human species like Neanderthals and Denos that seem to not have a drastic decline in population even though they were closer to the eruption than Homo Sapiens. Also, Homo Sapiens were just moving into Asia when the eruption went off, so the chances that the eruption could have affected the human population were there, but there isn't much evidence. The Toba Catastrophe theory has evidence supporting and disapproving it, but it's mostly seen as disproving theory as most likely the eruption had a mild effect on the human population. The Dogu are these clay figurines that were made in the Jomon period of Japan that dates from 40,000 to 400 BC. The Dogu are very recognizable for their abstract style and sometimes detailed designs on them. There's even 4 types that are categorized as the goggle-eyed Dogu, which is one of the most famous ones of the 4 that has these unique designs on them and have these goggles that are believed to be resembling Inuit snow goggles, since some of them were found in the sites where it snowed. The pregnant woman, as the name implies, have figurines that seem to depict pregnant women or women in general. Heart-shaped figurines that have specific facial designs be the focus. And lastly, the horned owl type that seem to depict mix of human and animalistic features. As cool as they look, we don't fully know what is being depicted and for what reason they were used for. As you may have noticed, the gender of the figures are kind of a mystery. Since they're so abstract, the gender tends to lean on being females, since some of them seem to depict pregnant women, and there's no distinct masculine trait in any of the Dogu figures so far. One guess is that the masculine trait we're looking for are these phallic objects that are soon to go together with the Dogu figures, but that's just a guess. Depending on the location and time it was made, the figure's purpose could stem from a ritualistic use, to either help in fertility, childbirth, or the cycle of life and death. As a good amount of them have limbs or are just completely broken apart for some burial or ceremonial reason. And there are some that are fully intact that suggest that Dogus had different uses for them. Maybe there were Dogus that were used for paying respect to some important person, or to help cure your tummy ache after having too many dino nuggies. Regardless of what they were used for, these clay figures are truly fascinating to look at, and I wonder how much time it took for some hunter-gatherer to finish this art commission. The oldest musical instrument is something that's still being disputed still, but the candidate going for the title is the Giesenblock flute. I didn't even got that right. And the Dichep flute. I don't even got that right. Let's start with the widely accepted one, the German one. I'm just gonna call it the German one, I'm sorry. This flute was found in the Cavemen in Germany, where it was found with stone tools and artifacts made from bones. It is believed to be made by the Arignation culture, who inhabited Europe between 43,000 to 26,000 years ago. As the flutes were made from swan bones and mammoth ivory and are dated to be around 42,000 years ago. The flutes are said to be the oldest musical instrument made by Homo Sapiens, but there's another bone flute that is claimed to be older than that, and that is the Deep-Hip Bay flute. Made from a cave bear femur, this flute was discovered in a cave in northwestern Slovenia, supposedly dated to 6,000 to 50,000 years ago. The dating and supposed use of the bone flute is still under debate, as it hints that Neanderthals were the ones who made it. They were probably playing Funky Town on that thing. We really haven't seen anything like this from Neanderthals, leading to some experts to come to the conclusion that the bones are just a result of predators chewing on it. Whatever its status is, the flute is not accepted as the oldest musical instrument, and the one in Germany is. Overall, I find it fascinating to think that Homo Sapiens and maybe Neanderthals had a taste of music during the Stone Age.
What have I got?
You would think with the complexity and harshness of living as a Homo sapien during the Paleolithic era that humans might develop some sort of speech or language. Or hell, even archaic humans most likely develop some sort of speech. That question remains a mystery, as people in other species didn't leave evidence that will indicate language or what that language will look like. But as we always do when we don't have a direct answer, we have some guesses. I wouldn't be surprised if Homo erectus had some sort of language, because how would they expand outside of Africa without communicating during hunting or to get warnings of their environment? Another candidate for probably having language is Neanderthals, as they have a similar lifestyle to humans and also interacted with humans, so the chances of them having a language is pretty likely. On our own end, we got lucky that we developed our larynx and our brain capacity to develop complex language. But the question is, how did that first language look like, or how it sounded like? Some think we developed some sort of clicking language. Others think that we use our hands to gesture as a way to communicate. Whatever it was greatly was our edge towards other hominids, as the development of language in our species was one of the factors of us dominating nature and innovating that said language over time. I just wonder what that language kinda sounded like.
What have I got?
The Piltdown Man was a species of archaic human that was discovered in England named Eoanthropus dawsoni. The Piltdown Man was discovered and announced to the world by Charles Dawson in 1912. The discovery led to the idea that the formation of the brain came first before the development of the jaw in human evolution. It also led the idea that humans originated in Europe, and the last claim it made was that it was a missing link between humans and apes. The evidence we have for this species is the skull, jawbone, and some fragments that were dated to be 500,000 years ago. The discovery had many praises from other scientists that were influential and was believed for almost 40 years to be authentic. It wasn't until 1953, well technically 1924, and another project by the name of Franz Wiedenreich had called it out earlier but was ignored. In 1953, Times magazine published the findings of a scientist at the University of Oxford that the Piltdown man bones were a mixture of different species, like the skull was believed to be from a man from the medieval ages, the jawbone belonged to an orangutan, the molars were filed down, it was stained with chemicals to make it appear older, and lastly, all the bones were dated to be from different time periods. So the Piltdown man was a hoax, but why did this fraud manage to not raise any suspicion for so long? Well, during the time of the discovery, the origins of humanity were still a mystery. So discovering the site that answered that question was something archaeologists were looking for. So Charles, coming out with the discovery of the Piltdown man in England, put the idea that white European countries were the origins of humanity. Mind you, this is during the British Empire, so there was some nationalism going around. The Piltdown man, having modern human-like skull with a primitive jawbone, added fuel to the idea that the brain development was the key to human evolution. Obviously, we now know that Africa is the most likely starting for our species, and the features of the Piltdown man doesn't match how Homo Sapiens would look around that time, meaning it was too primitive for its time. Luckily, over time we discovered more species that filled in the blanks and led to more of an understanding of our species. The Piltdown man is an example of how the hype around finding the next big discovery can lead to hoaxes slipping through. Fortunately, frauds like this are very rare, mainly because the science of dating objects have advanced so much, and there always will be scientists out there to call y'all on your shit.
What have I got?
Just like the Clovis culture, Europe has their own cultures that span different time periods. The earliest modern human culture we start at is the Arignation culture that spanned from 43,000 to 26,000 years ago. The early humans, or Cro-Magnons as they're called, were most likely the first set of migrations from Africa that inhabited a major part of Europe and some parts of Asia. They're mostly known for their use of bone, ivory, antler, and flake tools that are scattered in caves in Europe. Another big thing they're known for, and I think I talked about it earlier, is their art. The Arignation culture left us a good amount of art pieces that gave us an idea of their lives. Probably the most well-known one is the Venus figurines, that depict women with exaggerated features like hips, breasts, and stomach, that sort of emphasize this idea of fertility, which most likely was their purpose. Not only did the Cro-Magnons have figurines of their favorite waifus, but had furry figurines like the depictions of animals they hunted that were engraved onto stone. Probably the one that takes the cake for uniqueness is the Lion Man figurine. The Lion Man figurine is almost 40,000 years old and depicts some human-lion hybrid that is still being debated on whether it's male or female being depicted, or even if it's a lion being depicted at all. The Arignation culture was also responsible for cave paintings like the Shaalbek Cave, Cave of Harignac, Cave of El Castillo, and many more. They also had some drip like jewelry and used ochre to not only paint cave walls but add colorings to their clothing and themselves. The Arignation culture is most likely the starting point where human society started in Europe. Also, the weird sexual and furry figurines makes me believe that we haven't changed much from our Paleolithic ancestors.
What have I got?
After the Arignation culture came the Gravitian culture that continued on and advanced the stone technology of their previous culture. The Gravitian culture spanned from 33,000 to 22,000 years ago. This is where we see distinct differences between geographical locations. Like the eastern side of the Gravitian culture was more specialized in hunting mammoths than the west side, but that didn't mean they were separated. Like the Arignation culture, we see similar stone tools used for hunting and for making accessories. Hunting wise, the culture was like the previous one, which relied much of their survival to the hunting of megafauna of the area, as the meat of the fauna helped feed their groups, while the bones and hides of the megafauna were used to make clothing and mobile homes out of them. Speaking of clothes, the fashion of that area must have been revolutionary, because we see bone being made into small needles for sewing, so this culture more than likely had detailed and decorated clothing. On top of flexing their clothes, they also had shell ornaments that were used to accessorize themselves, and sometimes were buried with them. Just like the previous culture, they also had their own art that they made and left us. We can see that the Venus figurines were more pronounced and detailed during this time. I swear, some of the Gravitian artists in the past were just really passionate for curvy women, cause these figurines were either used for ceremonies or some hunter was gooning to them in his cave. Nonetheless, the Gravitian culture was a time where humans faced the harshness of the cold weather of Europe at that time, and were hunting large game that probably kept them sustained in that area.
What have I got?
Sometimes called the Age of the Reindeer, the Magdaleneian culture is most known for their almost exclusive reliance on reindeer. Spanning from 70,000 to 12,000 years ago, the Magdaleneian culture precedes the Solution culture's ablaze by facial points and the consumption of mainly reindeer. Speaking of tools, the Magdaleneian culture improved upon the usage of bones by making them into harpoons, barbed points, spear throwers, and many more. They also couldn't help themselves to carve and decorate their tools and weapons, which you can see how detailed and important it was to them. No one just fully decorates their spear thrower to represent a mammoth for nothing. These tools most likely hold great importance to the owners. Hunting was the main mode of life, so stone-tipped weapons that were more geometrical and sharp to inflict the most damage to their prey was desired. Probably because of the advances in stone tools, there seemed to be a population growth during this time, as the sites in France hints that there was an increase in population from 15,000 to 50,000 in Magdalene. Going back to decorations, during the Magdaleneian times, we see an increase in cave art in caves like the Clovis and Altamira cave that has these paintings of aurochs, horses, deers, and more. I also want to mention the cave of the Trois Frères, where 2 detailed clay models of bisons were found. It makes me wonder what other explicit clay models they made. On another topic, cannibalism. The Magdaleneian culture seems to have a good amount of sites that hint that some of the inhabitants were being eaten. Some human remains in the sites that relate to the Magdaleneian culture show bones being cut and chewed on. The obvious idea is that humans were either hunted or sacrificed to feed the group, but the more accepted idea based on how the bodies were left is that these were burial sites. Some think that the Magdaleneian culture may have practiced some sort of funerary cannibalism, where bones of the deceased were used for ceremonies or used the skulls for cups to drink out of. Nonetheless, the end of the Magdaleneian may have came from the end of the Ice Age, as the climate started to change and the megafauna that humans relied on started to disappear. This doesn't mean that the people disappeared, but meant that people were now changing their lifestyles to survive this new climate and environment.
What have I got?
Discovered in 1979, the Red Deer Cave people have been a recent addition to the Homo genus roster. Located in the Red Deer and Longland Cave, the remains of the species have sparked some questions, mainly on how recent this hominin lived and if it's fully a Homo sapien. Let's start with what we have, like the mandible, skull, and femur. The mandible shows some archaic human features, but are not that dramatically different from modern humans. The skull showed that they have flat faces with brown noses, thick skulls, brow ridges, and a moderate brain size. The femur is where this gets interesting. The femur of this species shows that they were more similar to species like Homo erectus or Homo habilis than Homo sapiens. You might wonder, why is this important? And it is my fault that I forgot to mention that these bones are dated to be around 14,000 to 11,000 years ago, meaning that a species of Homo that had traits similar to archaic humans was around during the time of where humans were just starting to farm crops. To get more context, the last Homo species Homo sapiens encountered was Neanderthals, which went extinct roughly 40,000 years ago. So why is this species doing here so late into the game of evolution? Some speculate that this species are the last of their kind that lasted up until the end of the Ice Age. Another guess is that this is a result of a hybrid between Homo sapiens and another archaic human species, or that this species is a remnant of the early migration of the Homo sapiens that developed unique characteristics. Luckily, that question was answered in 2022, where it was revealed through DNA extraction that the species was indeed a Homo sapien, and hence links to Native American and East Asian peoples. But that doesn't give us an answer on why they have some outdated feature like the femur. Nonetheless, this species does give us an idea that Asia during the Paleolithic was more diverse than we thought, because it's mostly thought that Asia was mostly empty of any Homo species, besides Homo erectus and later Homo sapiens. But with more discoveries like Homo floresiensis, the idea that the world had a diverse and complex species of humans roaming around is becoming more understood.
What have I got?
The Sugar Idol is this wooden sculpture made from a really old larch. Discovered in the Ural Mountains, the idol was found in 10 pieces in the bog that helped preserve the sculpture. When the idol was reconstructed with their pieces found, it stood at a height of 17 feet. Described as having a face at the very top, hands on the side, and the rest of the idol is a straight rectangle with zigzags and faces that were chiseled into them. I know this doesn't look that impressive, but what makes it notable is that this idol is dated to be around 12,000 years ago, meaning the sculpture predates Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. So why was this 17-foot wooden sculpture made, and what does this idol tell about the people who made it? As always, we have some guesses. Since we know the date this idol was most likely made, we can conclude that hunter-gatherer groups living around the Ural Mountain were most likely candidate. Something that the chiseled art depicts some creation myth or mythological story. Another guess is that the idol is a way to help in navigating the area like a street sign or a warning sign. A third hypothesis is that this idol is an example of portable art, meaning it was brought around with people who made it and probably played a significant role in their beliefs. Whatever reason this idol was made, this shows that even hunter-gatherer people had resources to build big elaborate pieces of art. It was fortunate that the idol was preserved by the bog. As this gives us the idea that prehistoric people may have had sculptures or objects that were made of spiritual materials that didn't show up on their archaeological record because they rotted away over the years.
What have I got?
Behavioral modernity is basically the idea that there's some cognitive and cultural traits that only Homo sapiens have that distinguishes us from the other hominin species. Those supposed traits are utilizing abstract thinking like art, developing advanced technologies like tool making, forming a way to express themselves like music, planning and problem solving to think ahead, language to create a complex communication system, and lastly, social structures that practically defines our whole history. These traits can be found in the archaeological records, for example like cave art, seashell jewelry, javelins, long distance trading, regional differences in artifacts, and lastly burial traditions. This idea of when or where this started is still in the debate, but there's two schools of thought. The first thought is that some genetic change or the development of the vocal tract may have triggered the appearance of behavioral modern humans around 50,000 years ago. Also, this idea sort of tries to explain why our lifestyle was pretty much the same for thousands of years. The idea of human behavioral modernity gradually developing over a span of thousands of years is the second thought of how we came to be. There's also the problem that there's evidence of the likeness of other hominins having similar traits like Neanderthals. Neanderthals have evidence of burying their dead, making clothing accessories, produce sharp stone-tipped spears, and has social structures. So the idea of Homo sapiens individually developing these traits without the influence of other hominins or being solely human traits seems less likely, as the Homo genus seems to be more complex and connected than we thought.
What have I got?
Located on the Nile Valley near the border between Sudan and Egypt is the Jebel Sahaba cemetery site, where it's known for being the oldest evidence of human warfare. Discovered by Fred Wendorf in 1964, the site is dated to be around 30,400 BC. What makes the site significant is that 67% of the human remains show evidence of trauma that either healed over or led to their deaths. The trauma most likely being from projectile weapons like arrow points or spears, which 21 of the individuals still have arrow points embedded in them. For those wondering, yes, no one was spared, not even the women and children. That's what I call equality. Yes, the site shows that the violence was indiscriminate. There's also the fact that not until recently that we learned that this wasn't just one event, but recurrent episodes of violence. This is based on some individuals having healed and unhealed injuries, meaning they had multiple violent encounters. Whatever happened to the 64 individuals at the site, you probably will not know what triggered this violence or why the casualties were killed in these harsh ways. One guess for this site is that the time of the violence correlates with the end of the Ice Age. As climate and the environment shift made it harder for humans to survive, so local groups in the area started to raid or ambush other groups for resources and eliminating the competition. But that's just speculation.
What have I got?
Proposed by Tom Hartman, the hunter versus farmer hypothesis claims that ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a result of the transition in human lifestyles from hunter-gatherers to farmers. It is true that for almost our entire history on this planet we were hunter-gatherers for the longest time. So the transition to hunter-gatherers to farmers may have caused some traits to not assimilate to their agricultural lifestyle. This trait Hartman suggests may be ADHD. The hypothesis explains that traits associated with ADHD are linked with hunter-gatherer lifestyles like hyperactivity, which helps in movement and exploration, impulsivity, which allows for quick thinking in stressful situations, and inattention so that we can focus more on our environment. The hypothesis also explains that the routine and repetitive nature of agricultural lifestyle conflicts with the more adaptive and multitask lifestyle of hunter-gatherers. It is a funny image to think that past humans were just dealing with their ADHD while hunting a woolly mammoth. Hartman's hypothesis speculates that ADHD is not a condition but a trait of our past. Obviously with something like this, you might need some hard evidence, but as you might have guessed, this is more like a thought experiment. As Tom Hartman is not an archaeologist, or isn't any story that relates to the past, but is a radio host, businessman, and political commentator. So overall, this hypothesis should be seen as speculation of the past, and views ADHD under a different perspective lens.
What have I got?
The stone ape hypothesis posits that the consumption of psilocybin mushrooms by hominids played a role in human evolution. If you're not familiar with Terence McKenna, I'll give you a quick summary. Terence McKenna is well known in the psychedelic community as a prominent figure that spearheaded the advocacy of psychedelics. He also wrote books and done public speaking on the topic of psychedelics and how psychedelics are an important factor to the human experience. To get this out the way, psilocybin mushrooms can be found almost anywhere depending on the species, and are quite potent psychedelic. Speaking from experience, I understand where McKenna comes from with this hypothesis, as psychedelics have a profound effect on the user and can lead to an alternative view of yourself and the world around you. But remember that this is just a drug that alters your senses and gets you high. His hypothesis states that around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus may have encountered and incorporated psilocybin mushrooms into their diet. This supposed intake of the mushroom may have sparked higher thinking into the species, and will later pass down to Homo sapiens, who Terence claims that the intake of mushrooms led to the cognitive and cultural development in humans. Obviously with this kind of hypothesis you need some defining evidence for this, but like our previous entry, there's no evidence definitely supporting this theory, as the evolution of humans is a very complex and long process that we have somewhat of a good idea how it went down. What Terence is probably referring to as the moment humans became more enlightened is the Great Leap Forward roughly around 50,000 years ago, where he associates this sudden rapid advancement in human culture, tools, art, language, and social structures to magic mushrooms. Obviously this hypothesis is more of a fun wacky thought experiment than we can ponder about, but I think this hypothesis sort of undermines the long and arduous work that our species had to go through to get where we are. I do think that Paleolithic humans have used psychedelics for rituals and religious reasons, but I don't think they're the main reason for our development.
What have I got?
Discovered in 1913 South Africa, the remains of a partial skull and mandible was seen to have something strange about them. That being, based on how big the partial skull was, that the owner of the skull must have had a bigger brain capacity than modern humans, a 25 or 30% bigger brain capacity. Named the Boscom man or Boscom race, as at the time of the discovery it was thought that the partial skull was remnants of an ancient hyper-intelligent human species that had been forgotten. Because of the idea that their brain capacity was bigger than ours, that this species must have had a high IQ. So the skull and other remains were lumped together as their own species called Homo Sapiens. It wasn't until the 1970s where this notion of a Boscom race was dispelled. Even earlier during the 1930s and 50s where this idea was in a way disproven, mainly because we had an incomplete skull which is unreliable on telling how big their brain might have been, and the Boscom race idea mostly came from a time where scientific racism was in full swing. So the idea that the skull was a unique species was disproven early on, and were correctly identified to be anatomically modern humans, specifically from the Khoisan population, that are indigenous people who are still inhabited parts of South Africa. So why did 2 neurosurgeons write a book in 2008 basically trying to revive this old idea of a Boscom race? Who fucking knows, maybe they genuinely believed it or book sales just paid the bills. John Hawks, an anthropologist, criticized and pointed out how outdated the idea is in his blog, that I recommend going to know more of this wacky scenario. Overall, the Boscom man is now seen as a remnant of how archaeology was misunderstood in the past, and is sometimes misused as evidence for pseudoscience and conspiracy theories.
What have I got?
The aquatic ape hypothesis posits that during our evolutionary development that we are more fine-tuned for an aquatic lifestyle or gain traits from living in an aquatic life. First hypothesized by Alistair Harvey, who was a marine biologist, that traits like carelessness, bipedalism, body fat, and many more are attributed to humans once living an aquatic or waterside lifestyle. I personally was kinda convinced by this hypothesis, as Homo Sapiens are very unique compared to other great apes, and an aquatic lifestyle could explain a lot of our traits, but as always there's some cracks in this hypothesis. Firstly, there's no evidence in the fossil record that we were meant to live in a more of an aquatic lifestyle. We're more like an amphibious lifestyle if you ask me. For example, most of our cousins that are still alive can't really swim. They don't have the natural instincts to swim, so they just flare around and drown. That's why zoos use moats or bodies of water to prevent apes from escaping. But I will say that just like us, they like to play with water too. Secondly, most of the evidence for this hypothesis is circumstantial, as the traits that are associated with the hypothesis could also have been developed in a land-based lifestyle. And traits like bipedalism and hairlessness occurred separately over millions of years. There's one aspect of this hypothesis that may be true, is that for a time or phase in human development that we relied on seafood for survival. It's known that not only Homo Sapiens but Neanderthals and Homo erectus are known for having a seafood diet. Probably the best evidence for this are shell mounds, which are mounds of discarded shells and other material that Paleolithic humans left over. And from these mounds we could get vital information on diet and lifestyle of our ancestors. It's almost like we were meant to fish.
What have I got?
The killer ape theory explains that the reason why we split off from other great apes and succeeded as our own species was because of our aggression. Basically saying that violence is second nature to humans, and we benefited from being the most violent animal on the field. This theory also explains why we have war and interpersonal violence in human societies. The theory originated in the 1950s by Raymond Dart and further developed by Robert Audrey in the 1960s. The theory early on gained notoriety as it proposed the idea that humans' urge for violence is a big part of our psychology and was unique to us. The theory also hints that human aggression helped us in hunting and reproducing in the past. In more recent times, this theory has been more or less outdated, as human sociology and archaeology has pointed the finger at humans being more cooperative and social than violent in the past. Not to say that humans were not violent, as the life our ancestors had were pretty rough and required survival above all else. But to think that humans were inherently violent is not proved by scientific evidence, as it made more sense for our Paleolithic ancestors to cooperate with others in order to increase the chances of their survival. The violence humans shown in the past was most likely a byproduct, not a factor in how we developed. Also, this theory doesn't count for chimpanzees being one of the most terrifying animals to come across, as chimpanzees are known for displaying gruesome acts of violence against their own, and other animals when feeling threatened or hungry. So this theory is more of a relic of how early understanding of human development was misunderstood, and how one theory could change the narrative of how human nature developed.
What have I got?
The Paleolithic history of Japan has been sort of a mystery, as Japan started excavating archaeological sites only after World War II. So when an amateur archaeologist by the name of Shinichi Fujimura started to find artifacts dating back almost 300,000 years ago, way older than the idea of human arrival to Japan, which was around 30,000 years ago. Fujimura during the 1980s became famous as his discoveries gave a sort of national pride for the country, mainly because there was an idea in Japanese archaeological circles that discovering something that was older or the first of its kind was more significant. Nicknamed the Hand of God or Divine Hands, because he kept finding ancient artifacts in every site he went to, Fujimura became an important figure in Japanese archaeological teams, and his discoveries would be later be put on historical textbooks. It wasn't until 20 years later, on November 5th, the year 2000, that a Japanese journalist working for the newspaper Mainichi Shimbun published an article exposing Fujimura as a fraud by showing images of Fujimura planting artifacts at the site and later discovering them a day later. This scandal blew up and exposed Shinichi Fujimura as a fraud, and would lead to an investigation on all his discoveries, which led to the conclusion that most of his discoveries were just hoaxes. They were either just reused artifacts, modern made artifacts, or just regular stones passed off as authentic. After the scandal, the Japanese Archaeological Association will expel him, and Fujimura will formally apologize to the public, quoting and saying, "I was tempted by the devil. I don't know how I can apologize for what I did. I wanted to be known as the person who excavated the oldest stoneware in Japan," he explained. Because of this, historical textbooks had to be rewritten, all his discoveries had to be reevaluated, millions of taxpayer money went to waste as they were used to fund his excavations, and it put a stain on the credibility of Japanese archaeology. So how did this happen, and why did no one question his discoveries? The most likely reasons were bureaucracy, media, and nationalism. Bureaucracy because no student or anyone below Fujimura in the archaeological field was gonna question his discoveries. The media didn't help as they promoted and sensationalized his discoveries as facts and propelled him into fame. Nationalism because after World War II, Japan's curiosity on their people's origins became sought after, So academic scholars were more eager to discovering that, which led to them to overlook inconsistencies that Fujimura took advantage of. Overall, the Japanese Paleolithic host is a prime example of why we have debates and discord over discoveries has to prevent hoaxes from being presented as truth. The Stonehenge is a time where we most likely will not know the full details of, or get conclusive answers on, but I think we should not overlook it as it is our origin story, how we came to be and why we are the way we are. I sometimes ponder about the day-to-day life of our early human, or any other Homo species because I, in a way, want to know if they care for each other like we do, did they have petty disagreements like we do, did they somewhat understand what was going on around them, and did they ever have a self-reflection? These questions have to some degree have an answer to them, but unfortunately I understand that our history has a lot of missing parts that we will never know. Yet I understand that we as a species came a very long way to where we are now. Over millions of years, revolution has given us the ability to walk upright, use tools, make us more clever, express ourselves, and in a way have dominion over Mother Nature, something that we haven't seen in any other animal species before. I still can't go over the fact that there were more than one Homo species walking around when we were just making our debut into the world. I just wonder how different human history would be if any other Homo species survived with us to the modern day. Maybe we would have answers to questions we would never thought about that relate to us. It's just a little sad that we're the only Homo species left on this planet. No other species that we can relate to or communicate with. Overall, this video was a weird dive into my interest into this time period, and I hope you found this entertaining as I did. And with that, I can finally end this video.